I'm curious now when those slides are going to show up in the rest of the slideshow. If you've got your Bibles with you, please turn to the 77th Psalm. I want to turn your attention to Psalm 77 this morning. And we'll begin by reading together the first 6 verses of Psalm 77. I cry aloud to God, that he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wavering. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. This psalm opens up with the cry of a man who is in trouble. Doesn't identify what his trouble is, whether it's enemy from without who's attacking him, whether it's his life that's in danger, whether it's some kind of torment of his soul. It doesn't really make that clear, but he's clearly in trouble. And he says that he refuses to be comforted. And he moans at his memory of God. And so clearly he feels very distant from God. And he feels all alone. And when he thinks back about having fellowship with God, it simply causes him to moan in agony. When he meditates, he says his spirit grows weak. Now, meditation really should have the opposite effect on us. It ought to focus us and bring us closer to God and strengthen our spirit. But he says when he meditates, his spirit grows weak. And then he expresses these words. I think these are the ones that stick out to me the most. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. He just doesn't have any words. He doesn't know what to say, but that's not even his biggest problem. He's saying, I can't say it. I can't speak. I'm so troubled. Many of us have been in this place at some point in our life where we are sympathetic, I think, with the things that are expressed in these opening verses. Some of us possibly are in such a place right now. What we want to do this morning is listen to the case that is presented by the psalmist here, and keep in mind that this is inspired by God, that this is here for our benefit and our learning. We want to hear the case that's made in this psalm about how we find ourselves out of this place, because that's really what this psalm is about. This opening is simply setting the stage for where he is. And this psalm is about finding our way out of this kind of circumstance. The first thing to do when you have a problem, when you have trouble, actually is to identify the problem. You can't deal with something until you recognize it. And the problem here is that we get in such a place by focusing on our circumstances and by focusing on ourselves rather than on God. And so that's what he goes on to talk about. Look at verses 7 through 9 with me. He asks a series of questions. We want to look at those questions and glean some insight from them. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Now, these are interesting questions that are asked. There's 5 questions. And the fact of the matter is these 5 questions arise from a myopic vision, from someone who's nearsighted, from someone who can't see past their present circumstances, their present trouble, who can't see past themselves. These are the kinds of questions that you ask when you're focused on yourself and you're focused on your situation. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Now, there's neither reason to believe that my current trouble is caused by God. And that's what's suggested in this question. Will the Lord spurn forever? Is God against me, and is he always going to be against me, is the essence of this question. There's no reason to believe that my current trouble is caused by God, nor believe that it's going to last forever. Absolutely no reason at all in the world to believe that. And in fact, the book of Job makes clear that both of those things are completely false. Job was a righteous man. Job suffered greatly. He lost essentially everything except his life. And I'm pretty certain that Job got to a place that he would have just as soon lost his life, that living was an added burden to him. None of it was caused by God, and it wasn't caused because God had spurned him. And by the time you get to the end of Job's story, you see that the favor of God returned to Job. He went without the favor of God for a long, long, painful time, but it was not forever. No reason to believe such things as this. When I say something like this, it's because I'm not considering anything besides my current circumstances, because the pain that I'm in, because the fact that I'm uncomfortable. I'm not thinking about anything else, and I just say, is it ever going to quit? Which is what this question really is saying. His next question, first part of verse 8, has his steadfast love forever ceased? Now, this is kind of an interesting question to me. The question makes a fatal error. The fatal error is in assuming that if I have trouble, it means that God doesn't love me. Has his steadfast love forever ceased? It assumes that his love is not there. The question, interestingly, acknowledges that God's love is unfailing. That's what steadfast means. Has God's unfailing love forever failed? Is what this question is. Do you see the problem with that? How can unfailing love fail? It doesn't work that way. And he knows down deep inside that God's love has the characteristic of being unfailing. But then he says, is it going to fail forever? This is an internally incongruous question, and it clashes with the character of God that we ought to know. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, for I, the Lord, do not change. If God loved us, and God's love is unfailing, God doesn't stop loving us, and his love doesn't ever fail. He doesn't change. The third question, the latter half of verse 8, are his promises at an end for all time? I would submit to you that this question at least borders on, if not is completely blasphemous, because it is ultimately suggesting that God is a liar. Are his promises at an end? It's suggesting that God would make a promise and then not see it through. The fourth question, has God forgotten to be gracious? As if God could forget anything. Who's going to find fault with God? Will I find fault with God? Ultimately, that's what this question is. God, why aren't you being gracious to me? The fifth question, has he in anger shut up his compassion? Do we really believe that God is that petty? That God is going to look down at me, and because I have done something, that he is going to say, you know what? I'm going to withhold my compassion from him. I'm going to show him. What these questions ultimately are doing is projecting the shortcomings of me onto God. I am sometimes petty. I do sometimes withhold things from people because I'm upset with them, that they said something wrong to me or they behaved in some way differently than I wanted them to, and so I withhold from them Sometimes I forget to be gracious. Sometimes I don't carry my promises through. Sometimes I don't love like I ought to. These are characteristics of humanity. What we're doing is projecting them upon God when we ask questions like this. And that's what happens when we focus upon ourselves, when we focus upon our circumstances, when we focus upon this material world. Circumstances and ourselves are never the answer. That's what gets us to the point that we are in utter despair, that we can't find rest, that we can't find sleep. He holds my eyes open. I can't sleep at night. When I think of God, I simply moan. I find no comfort. I find no rest. I find no hope anywhere. How long is this going to go on? I get to that place by focusing on me and by focusing on this present world. So how do I get out of it? Look with me starting in verse 10. I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I'll remember your wonders of old. I'll ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You're the God who works wonders. You've made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. God was everywhere and he was doing all this, but your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. There's probably a whole lesson that could be offered on just that one verse, the fact that God was working and doing all these things through Moses and Aaron. And God's providence, God's use of mankind to accomplish his work is implied here. What he's saying is that when we look honestly at God, when we quit projecting our shortcomings on God and treating him like he's one of us, like we're equals with him or something, when we look honestly at him and all that he has done and we think and meditate and focus on him instead of ourselves, then we can pull ourselves out of this pit. God's greatest witness is the way that God has worked over all of the years of time. All of these things are allusions to various things that God did at various times to make himself known, to display his power, or to deliver his people. And he delivered his people over and over and over again. He raised up men to lead them. He raised up men to lead their armies. He directed them and gave them a law. He just over and over and over again provided a way of escape from their troubles and hope for the future. His power and his faithfulness in these deliveries are clearly seen. If you read from the latter half of Genesis until the end of the book of Malachi, you will see just over and over and over again the faithfulness of God and the power of God at work to provide and protect for his people. But there's a warning in this too. We don't want to miss the warning. The way of deliverance is not easy. He delivered the descendants of Israel, and he makes reference directly to one of these things. He delivered the descendants of Israel through the middle of the Red Sea and across the wilderness. Now, he actually makes reference to that one, I think, in two places in these short verses here. He talks about the fact that the sea trembled at God. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The ocean responded to God. The sea split in two, and dry land appeared because God desired it to be that way. It happens again with the Jordan River when the disciples enter into the promised land with Joshua. But listen, when they were standing there at the side of the sea and the Egyptian army was behind them, they didn't think they had a way of escape. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to step down into the bed of the sea and to walk across the sea. It was not an easy trek. And when they got out of the other side of it, you know what happened? The water closed behind them. And then they were over there and they had nothing. There was no water. There was no food. They didn't know where they were going. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a simple way. They had to walk all the way across the wilderness to get to the promised land. They failed on the other side, but that's another story. The point is this, that God is there and God's power is there and God is at work and God will deliver his people, but his people still have to walk. And sometimes where they have to walk is scary. God's deliverance is a way that requires faith, and it requires effort. We read about that in the Bible class this morning, didn't we? When he sent out the 12 the first time, and he said to them, don't take any money with you. Don't take an extra set of clothes with you. Don't take a bag with you. Just go out without food. Had to be frightening. It required faith. It required effort. It's not easy. It's never easy. Jesus made it clear that his way was not easy. And it's not always immediately apparent at the moment of trouble that the way is even there. Again, I refer to the children of Israel standing at the shores of the water with the Egyptian army pressing upon their back and thinking, there's nowhere for us to go. Why did God bring us here? And then when they got through the water on the other side, they said, there's no water and there's no food. What, did he bring us out here to die? It's not always immediately apparent what the solution to the problem is in the moment of the trouble. You just have to listen to God. You have to follow his will. You have to do what is right, and you have to trust him, even though it doesn't look like a solution. I want you to consider for a moment a testimony and then a promise, and we'll bring this to a close. The testimony is one that comes from Joshua. If you want to turn to Joshua chapter 21, we're going to look at verse 45 in just a moment. Joshua was, of course, the man that was raised up by God to lead the people after Moses was to die. Joshua was the one that was chosen to actually deliver them into the promised land after the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness that happened to that generation because they didn't trust God and follow his commands. And Joshua now, after a lifetime, Joshua is one of only two people that lived through part of that 40-year generation and then lived to actually enter into the promise. After a lifetime of watching God work and watching God deliver his people, this is what the testimony of Joshua was. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. Notice the past tense in this language. It's all come to pass at this point, and he says not a single word of the promises that God had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. That's a pretty profound testimony, offered over a lifetime of witnessing event after event after event, day after day after day of God faithfully carrying out the promises that he made, constantly leading them out of trouble, constantly leading them to life, constantly providing their food, constantly keeping their clothes, their shoes, and all that they needed and used functional and useful to them, constantly caring for them. Everything he said to us, Joshua says, came to pass. Now think about the promise of Jesus for a moment. There's two passages I want to read in connection with this. The first one in Matthew 28 and verse 20. Matthew 28, verse 20, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. In the night of grief and mourning and sorrow and pain and agony and trouble, when we are looking at ourselves and we are looking at our circumstances, it seems like God is so far off. As the psalmist said in the beginning of the psalm, he says, I remember the Lord and I moan. He didn't think that the Lord was still there. He didn't think that the Lord still cared. He didn't think that the love of God was still there. He didn't think rightly. Notice the promise of Jesus, I am with you always. You want to know what that means? That means when you're having a great day and everything is going your way and your faith is intact and strong and your brethren are encouraging and the worship is exciting and you leave the assembly charged up and ready to go out and be examples to the world of what faithfulness in following Jesus looks like, that Jesus is right there with you. But it also means that in your worst day, when everything is falling apart and every wheel has fallen off the cart and every problem that can possibly happen has presented itself to you and everyone looks like your enemy and it looks like there is nothing good that's ever going to happen again, that he's there. I am with you always. If we remember that and we focus on that, then we never get where the psalmist began. Now, it's hard, but we got to remember that not one word failed, that everything that was promised by God came to pass. And when Jesus says, I'm with you always, it's a promise he's going to keep. He will not leave us. He will not forsake us. We will not be in this alone. In John chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, let not your hearts be troubled. Whatever was going on with the psalmist in Psalm 77, his heart was troubled. That's what's very clear. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. Would I have told you that I go and prepare a place for you? Would I lie to you is what he's asking. Would I have said I'm going to prepare a place for you if it wasn't true that that's exactly what I'm going to do and that the place is there for you? If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. Just as surely as you can trust that I am going to prepare a place for you and that that place is there, you can be certain that I'll come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Now see, there's the promise of God. Not one word had failed. All came to pass. If I can see that that's true in his treatment of the children of Jacob, I can see that that's true in the treatment of those who have walked with God before me. I have to focus on that faithfulness, that stability, that unchangeable nature of God. And know that these things will come to pass. My problems are not too big for God, God has not quit loving mankind, which is an amazing statement in and of itself because sometimes we are quite unlovable. But he has not stopped loving us. Today's circumstances are not a harbinger of the failure of God's promises. God hasn't forgotten us. He isn't refusing to show us compassion. What's going on is the nature of life on this earth. That's what's going on. It's the result of the temporal nature of material things. Our bodies are material. Our houses are material. Our cars are material. Things are material. You know what happens to material things? They get old and they fall apart and they disintegrate and they break and they go away. They are temporal. They are short-lived. That's just the nature of the world that we live in. It is the result of our adversary's work in the world. That's essentially what we learned from the book of Job, that Satan is active and out there and causing trouble. That when Peter tells us that he's out seeking those whom he may devour, he's actually doing that. And so the trouble in my life might very well be as a result of the work of our adversary, the devil. That's part of living. It's part of our experience here in this world. It's also possibly the result of our collective diversion from God's ways. We're really good at parting from God's ways, leaving God's ways behind, and we create all sorts of problems for ourselves. Now, all that's just a fancy way of saying sometimes people sin, and sin causes problems. It's the result of the fact that God's timeline for his work is not based on my immediate comfort. He's not up there trying to say, okay, now I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that Michael Green is always comfortable and everything is always going good in his life. That is not his plan. His plan is much bigger than that, much more important than that. And it's about providing for the collective needs of all mankind. And so sometimes I have to wait in suffering until the time is right and the circumstances are right for things to change. And finally, it's often that I misunderstand his promises, which are for the most part about delivering my soul in eternity, not delivering me in time. And I think this last one is a big one that a lot of us get caught up in. A lot of our petitions to God are about here and now, and I want this, and I need, this would be better, I would like this better, this would be more comfortable, get me some relief. God's a whole lot more worried about saving our soul than he is about whether or not we're comfortable. God is alive, he is powerful, he is faithful, he is trustworthy, he will do everything that he has promised, just like he always has. And what we can do to help ourselves is to focus on him and what he has done instead of on ourselves. Because I'm telling you, if we focus on ourselves, we're going to get really depressed really quick. All the evidence supports these conclusions. In the 95th Psalm, it's expressed like this: "O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, on the day at Massa in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work." Don't make the mistake that they made. They saw my work and they put me to the test anyway. Instead, you learned. Don't harden your hearts. Listen to my voice. Consider my record. Trust me. We don't have time to read the book of Hebrews this morning, so I encourage you to make the time to do that on your own, particularly chapters 3 and 4, which borrow heavily from Psalm 95, that section of Psalm 95 we just read, which is verses 6 through 9 of the 95th Psalm. What I want to do in the moments that we have remaining is to focus on just 2 verses from the book of Hebrews, some conclusions that he draws. Chapter 4 and verse 16, let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We need to have confidence. Confidence that we can approach God, that God is there with us, that he is acting, that he is working, that he is protecting, that he is answering. And when the time of our need is there, it will be done. And in chapter 13, verses 5 and 6, he says, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? If we can focus upon God, if we can focus upon his record, if we can focus upon his promises, we can have that kind of confidence. We can live in that kind of hope, and we can avoid the kind of despair that cripples so many of us so much of the time. Never be afraid that we're alone. Never be afraid that he's not listening. Never be afraid that his love is gone. Never be afraid that he's withholding his compassion. He never has and he never will. Trust him, listen to him, and move forward. And see what happens. He's going to come again one day, and he's going to take all of us who are his to be with him forever. And faith will be turned into sight. And time will be turned into eternity. And we will be able, with the Apostle Paul, to say, we have fought the good fight. We've kept the faith. We have finished the course. And receive our reward. Lessons